Rehabilitation Centre for hosting this extremely stimulating and informative exchange and discussion. I'm going to talk about a tool that is developed by IUCN for identification of key biodiversity areas. And I want to, I'll venture that my comments might be useful and helpful for this discussion in three ways. The first of them is on the substance of the importance of identifying places that contribute significantly to the global persistence of biodiversity and its relevance in informing the kind of spatial planning activities that we've been discussing this morning. But then second, I think that my comments are maybe useful to provide two examples. An example of how IUCN works as a union of 200 governments and government agencies, including the Chinese government, and of more than 1,000 non-governmental organizations and indigenous peoples organizations. And indeed, encompassing independent expert commissions comprising more than 15,000 specialists around the world, including hundreds of experts from here in China. And we have representatives, leading representatives from two of IUCN's commissions here this morning, Jean-Paul Rodriguez from the Species Survival Commission and Mark Hockings from the World Commission on Protected Areas. And then the other example that I hope that my comments provides is of how the different tools and standards that are maintained by IUCN fit together, work together, and inform each other. Hence the comments that I'll make about key biodiversity areas providing ecosystem services to people, including nature-based solutions. So a theme that has run all the way through this morning's discussions has been how is it possible to maintain nature while at the same time meeting human needs in a fair and equitable way. And indeed that theme is one that is very, very familiar. It's the very vision of IUCN, a just world that values and conserves nature. It's extremely consistent with the Deputy Director's opening comments this morning, and indeed is at the heart of the Chinese principle of eco-civilization and across the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. If we are going to do that, we need to know the distribution of nature. We need to know where life on Earth is. And it's almost the first rule, if you like, of nature conservation, that both life on Earth and the impact that people have on life on Earth is distributed extremely unevenly. There's enormous variation in the distribution of those patterns around the world. So that's been recognized for many decades. And different countries, different regions, expertise in different ecosystems or different taxonomic groups have proposed different ways for measuring and understanding that kind of variation. And that's been hugely beneficial in all sorts of ways, but it's also caused some confusion, because how do we differentiate between, let's say, an area that is particularly important for birds relative to an area that's particularly important for butterflies or freshwater ecosystems? And so in 2004, at the World Conservation Congress, the IUCN World Conservation Congress in Asia, in Bangkok, IUCN's members asked the Union to put together all of these different approaches that have been developed over the decades to develop a standard for identifying places that contribute significantly to the global persistence of living nature, of biodiversity. And so that process was led actually by the two commissions that we have represented here, by IUCN's World Commission on Protected Areas and IUCN's Species Survival Commission. And it was a process that ran from 2004 all the way through to 2016. So it took 12 years to run through a global consultation process that went through multiple rounds of open peer review with public responses to all of the peer review comments. And finally led to the World Conservation Congress in Hawaii in 2016, where the global standard for identification of key biodiversity areas was launched. And I believe there's effort underway actually at the moment to translate the standard into Chinese and to publish it in Chinese. And you hear a repeated theme here of the importance of the IUCN World Conservation Congresses as a venue, as a platform, as a stopping point in these processes. What the global standard does is to bring together 5 different dimensions of life on Earth to measure and to recognize and to document the importance of particular sites in maintaining those elements of living nature. So that includes elements of nature, species or ecosystems that are particularly threatened with loss, drawing very much from work that has gone on through IUCN's Species Survival Commission and IUCN's Commission on Ecosystem Management in assessing risk to species or to ecosystems, red list approaches. It reflects that many elements of nature have very restricted ranges. Very many species, very many ecosystems, assemblages are found in very restricted places. And so information about that geographic restriction with quantitative thresholds associated with it is fundamental to the Key Biodiversity Area Standard. It recognizes that the number of places left on our planet that retain intact ecological function and integrity is very small, and so it highlights places that retain natural function, natural ecological function. And then it highlights that, again, biological processes, things like migration, for example, are also extremely patchily distributed, and there are individual places that drive things like ecological source sink dynamics that are disproportionately important for the retention of nature. So it incorporates processes as well as patterns. And finally, the standard draws from the academic disciplines of systematic planning for situations where there are comprehensive wall-to-wall data across entire regions or entire countries to apply wholly quantitative mathematical approaches to identify sites that contribute disproportionately to the persistence of nature. While the standard is a global one, the application is a national one. And so the core to application of the Key Biodiversity Area Standard is implementation within countries. And the most typical approach that's been used in very many countries around the world, very often working through the IUCN national committee mechanisms of different kinds, has been to establish coordination groups to bring together the different institutions, maybe different ministries, different universities and research institutions, different non-governmental organizations who have data to contribute to applying the global standard. And one thing that's being discussed, I know just a couple of weeks ago in Shenzhen, was the possibility of establishment of a China national coordination group for identification of key biodiversity areas. And then the effort overall at a global level is coordinated as a very broad partnership encompassing IUCN, encompassing a range of intergovernmental institutions like the Global Environment Facility, and a range of non-governmental organizations like, for example, the World Wildlife Fund. So again, IUCN serving within a broad partnership encompassing both public sector and NGO actors. The data generated through those national coordination group processes then go through a process of peer review to ensure their transparency, ensure their validity, and then into publication in the World Database of Key Biodiversity Areas. The standard is complemented by an extensive series of guidelines for application of the standard, which again I believe are currently in translation into Chinese. The World Database on Key Biodiversity Areas, the application of the standard, is not intended to serve any one particular use. Rather, it is intended to provide information that are useful in a range of different spatial planning contexts. And I'll highlight three of these here. One application, maybe the application that is considered most traditionally, is in helping to guide the establishment and management of protected areas, to understand places that need specific management and where it's appropriate to implement specific management for nature conservation purposes. And clearly that's important in China in the context of eco-redlining and the context of the consolidation of the national park system. But in the context of our discussions this morning, I'd like to highlight two other applications that may be particularly interesting to explore for the Key Biodiversity Area standard. One is in helping to guide management of sites, to guide management of places, not first and foremost for nature conservation, but in ways that while managed primarily for other uses, maybe forestry or agriculture, they nevertheless maintain the nature for which they're important. And this concept has been very, very broadly discussed over recent years, especially through the Convention on Biological Diversity, as other effective area-based conservation measures. And IUCN, especially the World Commission on Protected Areas, has been very much involved in helping to establish those guidance for other effective area-based conservation measures. And then finally, I was struck by this thinking about the Deputy Director's slides showing mine rehabilitation. Finally, the Key Biodiversity Areas standard can be particularly valuable in helping to guide restoration in cases where, in situations where particularly important places for nature have been degraded or cleared in different ways, to help to guide the re-establishment of the biodiversity for which that place was important. And that could be the case of forests, it could certainly be in the case of mining. Final couple of slides. So thinking about looking through to the benefits that maintaining important sites provides to people, the critical factor here is actually one of documentation. And over the last few years, IUCN's World Commission on Protected Areas and World Heritage Programme and the Key Biodiversity Area Partnership have worked together to develop guidance for how to document, for the different dimensions, documenting the different dimensions of benefits that maintaining important places provide to people. And this is just some examples published a few years ago now, actually, for a measurement of benefits provided by a particular subset of key biodiversity areas. And those looked across a range of dimensions. It looked across carbon storage and sequestration. It looked across maintenance of water quality and water provision. So very much in the realm of nature-based solutions, as we've heard earlier. But it also looked across other kinds of benefits, of ecosystem service benefits more generally. For example, maintenance of cultural diversity associated with living nature, and for maintenance of genetic diversity as option values for potential future use. And in all of those cases, the dark bars here show the key biodiversity areas, and then the pale coloured bars show equivalent sites selected elsewhere within the country within which those sites have been documented. And in each case there you actually see disproportionate values provided by places that are important for nature. But that's not necessarily the key point. The key point is one of documentation, the importance of understanding the values of important sites for people. And final slide here, just to highlight a platform that may be useful, thinking about bringing these kind of information bases together in a spatial planning context. This is a platform called the Integrated Biodiversity Assessment Tool, which brings together data from, for example, the Red List, very much emerging from IUCN's Species Survival Commission. It brings together the World Database on Protected Areas, emerging from IUCN's World Commission on Protected Areas, working with UNEP's World Conservation Monitoring Centre. And it brings together the key biodiversity areas data to provide an input layer, a consolidated input layer into spatial planning applications. Thanks very much indeed.
Great. So the last question also give to the young person. We try.
Good morning, ladies and gents. I'm in the office of reclamation in our center. So now we are working on we're writing the guideline for the international restoration. But I think the biggest problem we're facing is that there is a big gap between the scientific work and the practice. I mean, just as Ms. Luo mentioned, we want to use different measures to deal with different ecosystem problems. We can let the nature recover themselves or rebuild it. So the scientists tell us, well, it's based on the resilience of the ecosystems. But in reality, we don't even know how can we represent the resilience by indicators, and we don't know how to set the threshold of the indicators. And another is that when we deal with the problem in project scale, we don't have enough monitoring data, both on in history, and we cannot predict in the future in the circumstances of climate change. So we cannot wait for the scientific. We cannot wait for the scientists tell us what can do. But now, what can we do in the circumstances of not enough scientific support? Thank you.
Do we want to take a couple of questions to give us a chance to think about that very challenging one?
To broaden the
不是让他们问，
那我要是咱们没时间的，让他们问呢，我说只给他们
让他
一个机会。
们问一个问题吧。
再问一个问题哈，好了好，主席给大家再有一个问题啊，你们谁还有问题？
什么特别头疼的问题？
对，有没有特别头疼的问题 ？OK。
It's me again, and I have another question about the assessment about the biodiversity assessment and the ecosystem service assessment. We choose different index, so how do we link these two kind of assessments? And for the assessment, most of the time we think more about the supply of the ecosystem service, and how could we think more about the demand of the ecosystem service? That's all. Thank you.
I'll make a couple of comments, and then other colleagues may well want to add rejoinders. On the interface between science and practice, and IUCN, I think, sits very much at the middle of that gap. A first point is that we should always be operating, drawing the best information to hand, but not letting that delay action. We know enough to act already, but we should be continually striving to improve that guidance to action. Above all, through monitoring, as you emphasise. In terms of what IUCN can do to help there, in particular through IUCN's independent expert commissions, there is a very long tradition of producing best practice guidance. Best practice guidance around species conservation, around ecosystem restoration, around protected areas, and I would venture that a really useful concrete activity could be to advance making that very large body of guidance available in Chinese. And I know that some of that guidance has been translated, but it may be that that's an area that it would be very useful to concentrate on some more. On biodiversity assessment and ecosystem service assessment, there are a couple of ways in which that linkage is built in IUCN through the Red List of Threatened Species and the Red List of Ecosystems, which we haven't talked about a huge amount here. There are standard classification schemes, including for ecosystem services provided by a particular ecosystem or by a particular species, and that provides a set of documentation on the supply side, as you highlight. Looking at once you move from the ecological dimension to a spatial dimension, as you say, the demand side becomes absolutely critical. Whether or not there are people standing to benefit from hydrological services provided by a forest upstream or not is a fundamental difference in terms of whether that is a service or not, or a solution or not. And so the demand side of ecosystem service documentation and assessment is very much built into the guidance that I mentioned from the World Commission on Protected Areas and the World Heritage Programme and the Key Biodiversity Areas Partnership, in understanding the benefits of particular sites to communities that use them.
Thank you.
Again, going back to the discussion on mining and mining restoration and using all these methodologies, particularly IBAC. So we have a lot of very good experience in India. And we would very much like to see again whether there's any possibility of exchanging some of that work with you, because we're using some of the latest IUCN methodology in terms of restoration, degraded mine sites. And these are very big mines by very big companies. It's not government, well, there's one government site, but there are a lot of private sector sites as well. So maybe that's again an area of exchange and collaboration that we can encourage between yourselves and the Ministry of Environment and our office there.
I think
just to come to your question, and in your presentation, Dr. Liu, you put up one of the diagrams around adaptive management. And I think we hear a lot about adaptive management internationally. We see it written about a lot. It's much harder to find it put into practice. And I think one of the things that you could do is really explicitly try to use that adaptive management cycle to act now, as Tom said, but to gather information. I think in doing that, the other thing that you can add into your nature-based solutions, into forest land rehabilitation, any of the restoration projects, is the idea of building initially relatively simple ecological and social models, or socially ecological system models, to understand the system and what's creating the problems and how you're seeking to intervene. And that can help guide where you monitor. So again, monitoring's a challenge. It's difficult to get people to invest in monitoring when they're trying to do things. So it's important that we monitor the right things. So building those sorts of models can help you determine what you should measure to know whether what you're doing is working. So I think that's again, there's a growing experience in how to use those sorts of models to integrate with the other tools. I think the answer with all of these is one tool on its own will probably not address them all, but it's how you bring them together and then how you apply them in a really thoughtful way so that you can actually practice adaptive management.
Yeah, you just stole my idea. But what I wanted to say is that adaptive management does not mean act blindly. It doesn't mean act without knowing what you're doing. It means trying to, with the information that you have, make a picture of the system, try to understand what the problems are, and then try an intervention that solves a problem with your knowledge, move it forward, and then think again after you get the results. So it's not just being, let's try all these things, see what works. It actually means thinking about understanding the system. So these diagrams, these models, the social ecological models are super useful. And if you go to the Red List of Ecosystems documentation, there are some examples of what these models look like. And the good thing about them is that you, very simple, divide your ecosystem into boxes and the main processes, and then you try to understand which process is not working, and then how you can fix it, and then you try an experiment to fix it. And that's very, very useful, because that way you don't wait for all the knowledge, but you use the knowledge that exists to help you move forward. So it's really, and there are tools in the Red List of Ecosystems package of toolbox that have lots of examples of these models to help you think about them.
I can add one thing also, and that's about where knowledge comes from that you can use. So we can look to science and we can use that, but we also need to recognise the knowledge that local people and local managers hold and the way in which that can be applied. So we need to bring those things together. And just by way of an example, we did some work in Australia where we were looking at evaluating the management of our protected areas. And in many cases, there was very little monitoring available. We're talking about hundreds of protected areas. But we obtained the best available knowledge from the people who worked in those sites. And then I had a PhD student who tested that against monitoring on the ground. And what they found was that local people, and particularly local managers, know their areas and they do understand it. There was very high level of correspondence between monitored data and the knowledge of people. So we shouldn't underplay the knowledge that all of the people bring to solving these issues.
Thank you so much for this morning, the excellent presentation, and also very good discussion, and give us a chance to discuss directly with the worldwide intelligent knowledge, and also for our center, especially for the young people, they have the chance to see you and to get directly tutor, right, from you. And we think in the future we will bring this knowledge reach down to our practice work, and also we can find the area we can cooperate with the IUCN since we are on the process to join the IUCN as a agency member. Yeah, so we are so happy we have this kind of chance, and thank you so much for this morning for the all. And our Director General have a small gift for you and friends.
那这样的，赵主席，刚才今天那个上午的交流呢，比较好。我们给每位专家准备了小礼大红袍，希望大家喜欢。这也算是个中国的小特色吧。一会儿我们中午就在底下呢
对对对，
安排
是
简单执行的看。
对。
我们刚才他也说了，我们也正在积极的在履行这个加入会员的手续。以后我们就是更多的跟那个还有加强合作，
希望主席批准。
一些活动，早点批准我们，好吧？谢谢各位大家。
Mr. Tan said that this morning is a very rich and very productive discussion, and they feel gain a lot. Actually, their center is now in the process of applying to be the member of IUCN. Yes, and they hope once they become the member, the collaboration will be even closer with the IUCN. And also, he has prepared a small gift. It's a Chinese